Thank you, Zach and Riverside, for hosting this conversation this morning and inviting me to be a part of it. It's always a delight to visit friends here, and I look around and I see so many friends from different places. So thank you for giving up your Saturday morning to think together, to converse together about the topic before us. Just before I start, I will draw attention to the back table, if I may. My friend Ed Kleiman of Small Cloud Ministries has laid out some books for you there. Two things I think are important for you to know, or at least helpful for you to know. One, for as long as I've known Ed, he has been committed to distributing good literature so that believers and non-believers, so that any who are interested might find some help, some direction, some guidance to make progress with their questions. So Ed is very much a part of what we do and a part of my life and encouragement to remain open to questions and to try and be helpful to people. So this literature here is not adjunct, as it were, as much as continuing the mission of serving people with doubts and questions. Second, you should also know, and Ed will probably strangle me if I don't say this, Ed does not want any dollar amount to be an obstacle. If you do have $5 to give, you might want to know that that goes back to replenishing stock so that more books can be given away. But more than that, if you don't have $5 in your pocket or whatever, you're not in a place to give, you didn't bring your wallet, Ed doesn't want you to feel that you can't access the book table. So if you see during the break time, as you hear different folks speaking together, if there's something there that is valuable to you, potentially helpful to you, please do feel free to abscond with that. You will make Ed happy if the table is bare. Trust me. Trust me. All right. My title this morning, Kissing Christianity Goodbye, Why Are So Many Losing Faith, really comes from the 1997 book by well-known pastor of Covenant Life Church, at least at the time of publication, Joshua Harris. As many of you will know, Harris's book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, was a critique of the dating scene as he viewed it at that time in the late 1990s. He was 21 years of age and drew upon all that experience to critique the dating movement of that time. He also offered an alternate model. He was encouraging us towards what he would call, and many have called, a courtship model. This book went on to sell 1.2 million copies and really gave shape to what became known as purity culture. This was a landmark book, if you will, a surprising landmark, but one that was important for many, influential for a generation. And yet, 2 decades later, in 2016, I think was the first time that in 2017 and 2018, Harris, in response to various feedback, publicly reconsidered his views. He even issued an apology to those who were wounded by his teaching. He expressed concern, I think sincere concern, that his teaching had been adopted and had been applied in ways that were wounding, troubling, confusing to a great many. And then in mid-2019, Harris announced that he and his wife were separating and that he no longer even considered himself a Christian. He wrote on his Instagram post, "I have undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. By all measures that I have for defining a Christian, I am not one." In many ways, some of you listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that podcast where Josh appeared and was interviewed by Mike Cosper, in many ways, that simple Instagram post, like the landmark book 2 decades earlier, is still reverberating throughout our culture. It's surprising how often one hears his name referenced. And so this morning I start with Josh Harris, not because I know him well, that is not true, and not because I possess any unique insight into the reasons for his deconversion. I don't. And also, I'm not here to add to the chorus of criticism. That's not my intention this morning. And multiple sides have criticized Joshua Harris. I start with Harris because I personally know and have heard from a significant number of people who point to this moment, this book, this announcement as a seismic shift in their own faith. It may be that the sky has not quite fallen for these men and women, but the ground has certainly shifted. I've sat with men and women who will point to this author and this book and this conversation piece as somehow echoing, reverberating deeply in their own life and thinking. And so I start with Harris because in many ways, this is where I first began to really do a deep dive into the topic of deconversion or deconstruction. My wife and I grew up in Australia. We didn't come to the Christian faith until later in life. We were not in churches where this teaching was prominent. But I kept hearing this name in this book. And as I sat with people, I could see that so many were trying to salvage something of their faith. They were reworking and rewiring their story, their comprehension of Christianity in light of this significant figure announcing, by any measure, he is no longer a Christian. I have for several years now been collecting, reading, listening to stories of deconversion, deconstruction. On the one hand, it's quite a number, which is sad, and yet it's been helpful because one of the things I've learned along the ways, and one of the things I hope that Sage Christianity over time can help us with, is when you begin to enter into these stories and you begin to listen to individuals who are deconstructing, it's not pleasant. It's not easy. This is not simply faddish for so many. There's real deep pain as they try and untangle or make sense of their faith experience. This is the land of doubting, of deconstructing, of deconverting, of disaffiliating. And all those D words remind me that you may be helped by me offering you something of an outline. So let me just give you this. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes or so is offer some basic tracks that our conversations this morning might run on. This is not to constrain fellow speakers, but maybe just to get underneath some of the particulars. And I hope this serves us well. I do want to define those various D words I just mentioned. I think it will be helpful for us to know a little more about what we're talking about and what I mean when I use those words. But really what I want to do is reflect on the process of deconversion as I'm coming to understand it through the stories of many. And as we reflect on that process, we begin to get some insight, some understanding as to why so many in our moment of time seem to be moving through such a process of deconstruction, deconversion. So I want to do those two basic things this morning, if I may. Some definitions, a reflection on the process of deconversion, listening out for, paying attention to some of the particular reasons why many are losing faith in our moment of time. So let's go to some definitions, and here I'm less aiming for a particular level of precision. This is kind of my street level set of definitions, if you will. A more basic, yet I trust functional understanding of some of these key terms that you will hear in the literature, in the stories of people losing faith, and perhaps in other talks that we'll hear this morning. So I want to begin with the very basic idea of doubt. That's our first D word, if you will, doubt. To doubt is simply to be in two minds. To doubt comes from the Latin dubitare, to be of two minds. It is to experience a divided trust. It is the discomfort of having a foot in two camps, or as the Chinese often depict it, and this is very helpful, as having a foot in two boats. I like that image for a moment. Think about your experience of boats. Now picture yourself with a foot in two boats. Not pleasant, is it? Not easy. Those boats move. It's not stable ground. You can't stand there, stay there very long. It's quite concerning. You may end up in the water, right? To be of two minds. Importantly, however, to doubt is not necessarily to disbelieve. To doubt is not the opposite of faith. It's not the same as unbelief. Os Guinness breaks doubt down this way for us. To believe is to be in one mind about accepting something as true and as trustworthy. To disbelieve is also to be in one mind about rejecting that truth or refusing to trust in something for whatever reason. To doubt is to waver between the two. To believe and to disbelieve at the same time. Again, there's an existential discomfort there. That's not a natural place where we find rest or clarity. There's a lot I could say about doubt. I think one of the fundamental reasons why so many in our time are deconverting, deconstructing, is because they've been giving very simple and sometimes quite rigid views of doubt as the opposite of faith. They feel hemmed in. There's relatively little room to move. This is not treated as a part of how we as human persons come to know and reason and work things out. We learn in piecemeal fashion. We integrate new data, new information, sometimes with profound difficulty. Deconstruction can be helpful at one level. It can lead to profound, glorious reconstruction. But for many, they've not been given that space. They've not been welcomed into an understanding of the place of doubt in Christianity. We could spend a lot of time talking about doubt, but that's not what we're here to do this morning. I will say one more thing, though. We as Christians, those of us who would choose to identify with Jesus, those of us who are wanting and desirous of walking in his ways, we too would do well to spend more time thinking about our doubts and growing in an understanding of how doubts may actually do us some good. Very complicated topic for some of us, I know. Doubt can do us some good. That would be for another time. Deconstruction. In this slide then, having labeled doubt as we have, let me suggest that deconstruction is one response to doubt. It's not the only response that's possible. It doesn't have to, doubt as an experience doesn't have to lead necessarily to deconstruction. But deconstruction often flows out from and comes as response to the experience of doubt. Stated simply, deconstruction is the practice or process of reviewing and revising long-held beliefs, often with a view to integrating new understanding and experience. It's a cognitive process. It involves the whole of us, all of us. It's more than just our minds. But really what we're thinking about here is this integration of new data and belief, of reviewing and revising what it is we've come to believe is true, and now we are looking at again. While the term deconstruction might be new to some of us, actually it is now a cultural-wide phenomenon. The horse is out of the barn. This is not something happening in a far, far corner by very, very few. You can read the headlines of any major newspaper, online, in print, whatever your preference. You can read any number of journal articles in Psychology Today or Popular Religion, as well as more theologically rigorous publications. You can listen to podcasts and NPR radio interviews, and deconstruction and deconversion come up again and again. While the term does not have to mean the loss of faith, it is now commonly employed to refer to the replacement of the uncomfortable aspects of the Christian faith with more culturally and personally popular ideas. In theory, deconstruction is about disassembling belief and becoming more open to examining the nuances of belief. And I just want to say again, there's room here for this to be a good and helpful thing. My talk is not actually an anti-deconstruction talk, at least not simply. But I think we have to acknowledge, and the more people I've interviewed and listened to, and the more accounts I've read, in practice, for many, many, many people, deconstruction is often the pursuit of belief alignment with the values of the wider culture. We're not often seeing what we might think of as the more positive side. It's not that it's not there, but it's not what's being rehearsed and shared in many of our media outlets or on the speaking circuit. It's deconstruction then, coming out of doubt, one response to doubt. It doesn't stop there. We need to think also about disaffiliation. We might legitimately debate, I think, whether disaffiliation or deconversion comes first. What's the right order? I don't know. I'm really not going to die on that hill. But I think we recognize both now are a further step that flows out of a process of deconversion. This is another step in that process. Quite simply then, disaffiliation is the act of ceasing to be affiliated with something. In this context, to move out of or to terminate altogether affiliating with one's former set of beliefs or one's community of belief. Concretely, this is the stepping away from youth ministry. This is the 12-year-old who says on a Friday night, "Mom, Dad, I just can't go there anymore. I refuse. I don't believe what my friends in this youth group believe. I find those beliefs odious, troublesome, hard to hold, at odds with my other peer group or other teachings that I'm receiving." This is sometimes the pastor on a Saturday night who reaches that point mid-sermon preparation where they admit to themselves, you know what? Yes, sermon preparation is hard, but what I'm struggling with is not the process of hermeneutics, of interpretation. if I'm honest with myself, what I'm really struggling with is I just don't believe this passage, these doctrines, these things anymore. And I feel like a sham. I need to resign rather than preach and teach. I need to let my elder board know or my leadership structure know that I just can't do this anymore, and I won't. Disaffiliation is the stepping away from a belief set and the community of belief. Whereas to doubt was still to be in two minds, and to deconstruct was to respond to doubt by way of revising, revisiting previous held beliefs in favor of greater cultural alignment. To disaffiliate now is to tangibly act. It's not just that my ideas are disassembled, but I must leave them behind. I must move on from them. Disaffiliation is part of deconstruction, but it's a further tangible step. That gets us to deconversion, our fourth D word for this morning. Practically, deconversion and deconstruction are both broad terms that signal movement away from former certainties and commitments and towards a more agreeable sense of faith. In some faith traditions, deconversion may be synonymous with or labeled backsliding, falling away, even apostasy. Some people simply see the end result. Personally, I prefer the language of deconversion as it serves to remind me that there's a process unfolding that is sociological as much as it is spiritual and personal. Yes, deconstruction is a process, a multi-stage experience of transforming change marked by a sense of liberation from and opposition to one's inherited or formerly espoused faith. Did you catch the movements there? It's not simply saying, I don't hold that view anymore, but there's also a movement in opposition to what I once held. Deconversion is not static or stagnant. It turns in many cases, against prior belief. Deconversion is a process that allows individuals to become religious in new ways, to become seekers who are able to move in between denominations and even much wider religious traditions. People are enabled to look for a belief system and a community that fits and favors their current lifestyle. They're creating space for themselves to be authentically who they are. They're creating an arrangement in which they don't have to draw the lines quite so sharply or as tightly. And that sociological piece is important. Are there other ways to define these terms? Sure. The literature is full of more or less specialized definitions. There are even debates about the right order of things. But I think what I want us to grasp, at least, is some basic understanding of these language pieces, that we might have some idea of what they mean for our friend or our family member, our work colleague, our neighbor over the back fence. We don't give them the 4 Ds, right? That's not going to be a lot of help for those folks who are in it. But it may help us catch a sense of what they're passing through and where they are. And that gets me to what I really do want to do as I think about our journey in a rather pluralistic setting, our experience of trying to understand our own faith and to help others with theirs. What I want to do now is turn to this process of deconversion, if you will, to think a little bit about that journey, again, with one eye on the reasons why so many lose faith. Interestingly, there are multiple ways of naming and describing the process of deconversion. There are many fine sociologists of religion and philosophers of religion and biblical scholars who've studied these patterns and have come up with different ways of naming characteristic parts. Some people see 4 characteristics, some 5, some 6, some 7. There are different ways to name the landscape. I just want to acknowledge that, and I've learned from all of these folks. But this morning, and based on my reading and really based on listening to so many individuals, I want to think about a basic 5-fold process where I have begun to understand the way in which people move through loss of faith, deconstruction. And one of the things that's helpful to me, if we can get a handle on the process, then we're in a better place to think about pastoral intervention. If we understand this is not once and done, it's no small, light, trivial thing, but a profound reality that encompasses the whole person and often takes quite a period of time, that gives us opportunities for moments of friendship, moments of coming alongside, moments of understanding, of being able to intervene in potentially helpful ways. Now, as I say this, I also have ringing in my ears the words of a very dear friend who is quite thoroughly deconstructed, and she would caution me, rightly so, against the language of process and of trying to name the parts. She would say, Mark, I'm not your pet project. What you've heard me say to you is true, and I trust you with it. I'm not sure it's true for others in the same way. And I'm not sure I want you to approach me through the lens, the grid of somebody else's story. So there's a good note of caution from a wise, deconstructed friend. So what I've come to see is I want to pick up the lens of Jesus, who tells the parable of the growing seed in Mark chapter 4. This has been a helpful lens for me, and it's always helpful to go back to Jesus, right? How does he view the world? How does he make sense of complicated things, mysterious things? And he gives us this little parable about a man who sowed a seed in the ground. And then Jesus comments, he slept and he rose, and night and day passed by, and the seed sprouted and it grew. And the man, the farmer, did not know how. There's the mystery. There's the organic strangeness of watching something, expecting something. He's a farmer, you know. He chose the seed. He tilled the soil, right? He scattered the seed. He went to bed, and he just doesn't know how that grows. There's a mystery there. And yet we also see Jesus talks about the earth producing first the blade, then the ear, and then the full grain in the ear. In other words, there is a profound mystery, and yet there are characteristic aspects to this mystery. A mystery doesn't mean that we don't know anything at all. And so I just kind of borrow that piece from Jesus. And I say, as I listen to my friends, as I engage people's stories of deconversion, Mark 4 is my lenses. I'm very attentive, or I try to be attentive to the fact that each individual I'm listening to is a mystery. There are profoundly unique things and combinations of things with regard to their story. And we have to treat that seriously. And yet, the more I listen to people, the more I begin to see some characteristic features, some commonalities. And so I want to walk that line with you this morning. I want to talk about, I call it my still developing model. I'm still playing with this, so forgive me for putting this out there kind of underdone or half-baked perhaps. but you can push back in the Q&A time and let me know how to improve it. That would be helpful. So here's my fivefold sense of what's going on, and particularly what I think we might learn to pay attention to for people who are deconstructing, deconverting. First of all, I think we do well to pay attention to the preconditions. People don't deconstruct out of thin air. People don't deconvert for absolutely no reason. They're not walking through the woods one day thinking to themselves, today's the day, I might just pack it all in. It really doesn't work that way. What I've learned and what statistics bear out and what many people eagerly testify to is that huge numbers of the men and women that we are experiencing as deconverting, deconstructing, actually grew up in the church. These are not our atheist friends. Now, deconversion does happen in Hinduism, Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not unique to Christianity. It's typically, but it's found amongst those who have some religious conviction already, some religious formation in their life. And in our current cultural wave, when we read the statistics about the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, or the spiritual but not religious, we're really talking about significant numbers who are moving away from Christian faith. As I sit and as I talk with people, as I listen to their story, there are some common features that I'm learning to look out for, pay attention to. And these are also serving as some kind of foundational reasons as to why people begin this journey of deconstruction. Let me just give you four. This time they're L's, all right? Legalism. It is not long. There are now published anthologies of deconversion stories. You don't get very far until you realize the reports of legalism, that people's experience of the Christian faith was not primarily the grace of God, the goodness of Jesus, the kindness of his people, the freedom that they've stepped into, right? Rather, it's an experience of bondage, of strictures and strictness, of do's and don'ts. And that experience of legalism is profoundly distorting of their understanding of who God is and what Jesus has accomplished and where they might fit. We could say a lot there. Another feature, they're often related, is literalism. I've been struck by how many times when I talk to people about their loss of faith, they will point to particular Bible passages or particular sections, and from my viewpoint, they are just so overreading that. They are just standing on that verse, on that passage, and they are treating it in an absolutely wooden way. And I in my comment, I'm like, whoa, where'd you reach that conclusion? There are some other passages that balance that or inform that. And quickly you realize that's not how they've been taught to read the Bible. Right? They've not been given a notion of the Bible as a unified, overarching story. They've not wrestled with continuities and discontinuities. They've not been helped to read their Bible much at all. Typically, there's a diet of Sunday school stories, and then some pretty heavy-duty application of certain passages that must be adhered to. That kind of biblical literalism has been very worrisome to me, and for many has caused them to overthrow their faith. Loneliness, isolation, this ought to break our hearts. The numbers of women and men who report their experience of community as basically watching on from back here, of not being welcomed in or not being helped to engage. We have a generation of people who are lonely in church. They may be hearing good things, not the literalistic or the legalistic things. They're hearing good things, but there's no one to process with, and there's no one to live it out with. And then what I call here levels of criticism. This is a bit of a catch-all, but this idea of walking on eggshells, of getting it right, of always being critiqued. I'm 50. I didn't become a Christian until 1920. One of the big movements of my time in Australia, we didn't. I don't recall ever bumping into purity culture so much, but the accountability movement was a big deal. And so for me, part of becoming a Christian was always being in accountability with someone, to someone, and often multiple layers was better. And on the one hand, I want to say there were some good things and helpful things about that. But over time, I didn't know my own mind always. I struggled to make basic decisions. There were other people who would make those or determine those or needed to process those with me. Now, again, there's a lot of good things going on there. But in my experience, and as I listened to others, what was not happening was any real encouragement towards maturity, discernment, wisdom. This kind of wraps back around to legalism, right? We want you to behave a certain way. We want you to stand firm, stand up, stand strong. We don't want you to get it wrong, mess it up, right? So accountability was the protective hedge. I think what we also need is to have wise people walk with us, share their wisdom, that we become wise, that we learn how to navigate life. So there are these preconditions, there are these kinds of experiences, these characteristics that I hear very, very early on in the deconversion stories of men and women that I sit with. These are basic things. And my guess is in a room like this, and for many of us, I saw people nodding. We know them. They're not foreign to us. But I trust we know this is not really the essence of our Christianity. This is not really the vision that the Bible has for us. This is hard to match with the life of Jesus and how he navigated people and place and those kinds of things. So there's something stultifying here. There's something off here. And we see this early on in the deconversion stories of so many, that they got off on the wrong foot, we might say. It could have been well-meaning. They may have been stuck. Maybe it wasn't intended that they stay in these safe spaces or curated spaces. But we see over time that that's where they stayed, and that's where they were encouraged to stay, and they outgrew that. So then we get to a second stage of deconversion, which I'm just going to call pressure points. There's some discomfort, some concern that I'm not experiencing the freedom, the fullness of Christianity that I'm hearing preached. That doesn't characterize my life. I'm growing, I'm maturing, and I'm beginning to see things and think for myself, and things don't quite square. There are a series of pressure points. And this is perhaps where I'll most overtly address why so many are losing faith. What I did, I took about 240 narratives of deconversion, interviews of deconversion, and sat down and started looking, what are the pressure points? What are the things that people report and share? And I've created 3 buckets, okay? I'm going to talk about church culture, confessional content, and Christian conduct. And I've got to do this quick because my time is elapsing. But here are some pressure points, right, that people frequently report. With regard to church culture, purity culture comes up again and again. Those of us who are perhaps in our 30s and 40s, maybe late 20s, but 30s and 40s, this was a feature of the North American landscape. It wasn't just Joshua Harris who was kissing dating goodbye. There was a whole plethora of books, right, and conferences and pledges and purity rings and fill in the blank, right? All kinds of ways that you were being asked to signal your commitment to a chaste life. over time, and again, coming out of the soil of legalism, literalism, and so on, purity culture became, in many contexts, simply policing sex, determining or over-determining what the boundaries are, what good behavior is, what it's not. Again, there may have been some well-meaning counsel here. There may have been some good biblical help, but it began to take a form and a shape that many people now report as being repressive, distorting, injurious. People feel like the church had too much interest in watching over their sexual activity, that pastors and priests were too fearful and therefore too involved in communicating what a person should or should not do. There was also a sense, whether perceived or real, and the truth is both, with regard to what would happen if you didn't comply. There are some absolutely tragic stories of women and of men who didn't keep their pledge, who took off that purity ring for whatever reason or whatever circumstance, and in honestly feeling guilt and in honestly grappling with shame and wanting honestly to bring that forward to their Christian leaders, were rebuffed and rebuked and were driven into the shadows and the wings of the church. They could not be a first-class Christian anymore. We have so many reports of women and of men who were told that if they kept themselves chaste, Mr. Right or Mrs. Right would just be around the corner. And many are saying, we've never met him or her. I'm alone. Others were chased out of the church because of their conduct and struggled to reconcile Jesus' treatment of people with how they were being treated. We could go on there. My friend Amy Bird has written very helpfully, and others have too. There's a growing literature. The good news is the church is now correcting its position. The church is beginning to draw more nuanced lines as to how to help people navigate their romantic life, their sexual life. Here's another big pressure point, a huge area of conflation. This is particularly true in our current millennial generation. This is the conflating of the church with the nation. Christian nationalism is biting us. It's hurting us. The adoption of party politics with the way of Jesus, a Christian platform, is dividing us, alienating us from one another. People are confused. Because I vote one way, do you really mean I'm not welcome here? That I don't fit anymore in this church, Bible study, whatever? This is huge in the literature. People who are frustrated and angered by the church's rather wholesale adoption of a particular political platform or a particular political figure. This is a huge burning issue that's hurting us. And then I think in terms of church culture, again, is this idea of anti-intellectualism, that our curiosity is denied us. People of all ages report bumping into questions, experiencing doubts, perhaps even fears, and discovering that there's no real interest in dealing with them. Just believe. Have faith. Pray more. Come to church more often. Get the study Bible edition of your favorite translation. Apparently those footnotes are magic right there, right? The heavier the Bible, the more certain we become. I don't know. What we're experiencing and what's reported by a great many is this notion that I want to bring my doubts forward. They're troubling to me. I just don't find those who'll receive them in a helpful way. There's no real interest and there's no real inquiry into me. Help me. This is writ large across deconversion stories. And I think for those of us in a room like this, if we're honest, all of us have doubt somewhere. All of us have things that we can't quite square, right? But many of us are here because someone did show an interest, was willing to help us, or we found that person. Again, I'm thankful for book tables like Ed has provided and Sage Christianity like Zach is setting up for us. Places where our questions might find their answers is critical. It has been in every age of the church, but it's especially critical now because we've inherited the reputation. And I would love to say they're wrong. I would love to say I can show you the books, I can show you the communities. But having worked in L'Abri Fellowship for almost a decade, there are some good examples. There are some safe and wise people, but there's too few. And again and again and again, I've heard and I've watched men and women say, there was nowhere to go, I'm telling you. I wanted to talk about this. I wanted clarification. I know I needed help. I understood that my head and my heart were now wandering in strange space. No one pulled me back. No one illuminated the path I was on. Where was that help? So these are the kinds of pressure points that emerge out of our church cultures. These are some of the reasons why so many are losing faith. I've really got to pick up the pace here. Let me just be really quick. In terms of confessional content, this is where we find all of those biblical problems. This is some of the more traditional avenues of doubt and confusion. If I were God, surely I'd make things a little clearer. Why does he have to hide? If I were God, why a book in strange languages about strange cultures, about people who, quite honestly, look pretty average, and I'm never going to meet them? These questions have always been there in one form or another. There are all kinds of biblical problems that have gone away. How do we square different endings of different books? How do we understand Jesus' teaching when his images invite differing conclusions, perhaps? What about the ethical commands? Surely that was then. This is now. Paul, come on, buddy. What are you talking about? Women should be submissive and silent. Surely Paul was a man of his day. We can move on. Joshua, come on, buddy. Those Canaanites, they just couldn't have been that bad. What do you mean, wipe them out in the name of God? Right? These are long-standing questions. We actually do have many resources available. But how few of those resources ever make it in a meaningful way into the hands of those who have these questions is another conversation altogether. If this were a convention of Christian publishers, I might have something to say about that as to what we publish, how we publish, and where those publications go. Not just biblical problems, but denominational peculiarities. I think for many people in this current phase of deconstruction, the idea that we've found the right denominational home, or the idea that the Presbyterians got it right and the Methodists got it wrong and the Baptists are weak over here and the Assembly of God people are doing too much over there. This constant criticism of one another, of the Christian family tree, is hurting us. Jesus says it's by our love for one another that the world will know that we're his disciples. Right? There's meant to be a visible, tangible, expressed sense of unity. That doesn't mean we can't disagree or we might view things differently, but this kind of bickering, this kind of pointing out, some of our membership classes that draw heavy lines, well, I know you were raised here and went there, but to be a member of this place and to inhabit this space, you need to cut that out, cut that off. Sometimes admittedly, clear lines do need to be drawn sometimes. It's really hard, it's really confusing when we're multiplying the lines of people who love Jesus like us. I know several folks, well-meaning, who are just fatigued and exhausted by trying to make sense if they're in the right congregation on a Sunday morning, or can I send my kids to this youth group down the road, or Christian conduct. This is easy here. This splits into two categories, what I call the self-directed and the other-directed. So many people report losing faith because of the experiences of repression, shame, exclusion. People are made to feel out of step, not fully embraced or given the opportunity to be fully embraced. People these days are sensitive, rightly so, to how they might fit in and contribute. And people often bump into the barriers of not being able to fit in, of experiencing a sense of shame, alienation, separation that they thought the gospel intended to overcome. This is writ large in the area of race, is it not? We know this well-quoted line that Sunday morning in America is still the most divided hour. That should make us weep. That remains true is absolutely horrifying. And yet it's not just that we can't solve the macro picture, but then when we come to church, we don't see the other. We don't see our neighbor, our school friends, our work colleague. We see us. And then we begin to hear that distinction justified from Scripture. That has been a very profound and powerful turn-off for this present generation. The church is not living up to its promise. The church is not following in the way of its master. And then, of course, we get into the other directed when this is overlapping, just hypocrisy. Hypocrisy continues to appear in the literature of deconversion, of Christian leaders saying what we should all do and of doing something else over here. Think of the scandals that have rocked the church in recent years. Spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, financial greed and gain. Sin comes in a variety of forms. Jesus was not surprised by that. Jesus consistently pointed out what the wages of sin bring forth. Jesus also gave us this incredible gift called repentance, that when we get it wrong, there's a mechanism for putting things right. And yet what many report is a refusal to put things right, an unwillingness to repent and return to the teachings of Scripture, the way of Jesus. All these things build and mutually reinforce. These are the reasons that we hear again and again and again why people say no thanks. And this gets to the point of no return. I could say more about that. I won't, except to say these things experientially build to kind of a boiling point. We may not even be fully aware of where we are and how deep our feelings flow. Francis Schaeffer had the illustration. He talked about the donkey of devotion. He took a fairly common image from kind of rural towns and from, I think in his case, he saw this in Spain, if I remember correctly. But this idea in a village of a working class man or woman who maybe had a donkey, a mule, and that animal did everything. You know, you walked it into town with a load of wood, and you sold the wood. And you loaded it up with supplies, and you walked it back to your home, and then you took it out in the field, and it furrowed the ground, and you carried your kids on its back to the house. This donkey is loaded and loaded and loaded. And then one day the owner comes out of the home and goes to the stall, and the donkey is miraculously, surprisingly, unexpectedly quite dead. What happened? Was it that last child who rode his back? Was it that last quarter mile of ploughing the field? Was it that second trip into town with a load of wood? It's the cumulative case And Schaeffer said, we have men and women who are burdened by so many things, and we keep saying, just believe, pray more, have faith. We're not really listening or engaging or intervening. And so surprise, surprise, one Sunday morning, they're not in the pew, they're not at the youth group event, they're not at the family worship time, they're not anywhere. Their faith has died. The donkey of devotion, it collapsed under the weight, the cumulative weight. Many of our people have reached that point. That's it. No more. Too hard to think about. Can't handle the disappointment. My head aches from trying to work this out by myself. I know I should go to my pastor, my counselor, my friend, but you know what? I just don't want the condemnation. I don't want the extra time of prayer or whatever it is that's being handed out. I'm done. And even they can't point to one particular thing. This starts processing. You thought we've been in a process all along, but now all this rises to the surface. These various experiences and pressure points build and intensify so that people often attempt to rescue their faith. People often, we would find this at L'Abri, you're the last stop before I'm done for good. Show me what no one else has shown me. No pressure. Solve what no one else has solved in this limited amount of time, right? And it can be a good faith attempt. They don't always know what they need or how deep it goes. But for many, this is where it gets real creative. This is where we cut off the edges of difficult doctrines. This is where we look for some kind of more reasonable mode of relating to our faith tradition. When the rescue fails, disenchantment follows. Disillusionment provokes feelings of rejection, fear, guilt, alienation, loss, and grief, and that leads to the next and final part, the pathway out. See, at this point, I've reached my conclusion. At this point, I can justify my actions. At this point, I know I don't believe that anymore. I'm pursuing this. True deconversion occurs when the individual or group actually breaks down their unbelief, where rescue efforts are over, where rejection of particular beliefs harden and set in. We now collect reasons why former beliefs are untenable. We now reject former ways. We recalibrate our life and our life choices according to a new North Star, a new authority of some kind. People don't always recognize it as an authority. People report freedom. People report independence. People report, rejuvenation. But very few deconverts deconvert alone. And that's one of the realities that makes deconversion such a prominent feature of our landscape. If you and I woke up in the Middle Ages and wanted to deconvert, it'd be pretty hard to do, actually. All of life would support and bolster and push back on our choices. In the 21st century, we can always find someone who thinks like us, who's going to cheer us on, who's going to agree with our principled stance against tradition, against the common inheritance of faith. I don't want to blame social media for all ills, but it's a fact, a demonstrable fact, that it has accelerated and amplified the experience of deconversion. I'm not alone. I can find people who have the same angst, the same grief, the same horrific, shameful experiences, and who will help me in very real ways, but will also help me in unhelpful ways towards leaving, moving on. Speaking of leaving and moving on, my time is elapsed. I may maybe just end this way because we want to. What does that mean for us? I hope that's something we can talk about in the panel time, and we'll hear from Katie and Sean a little bit too. But if I could speak to those of us present this morning, whether on the live stream or in the room, if we're thinking about how do I serve my friend who is in deconstruction, I hope you have a sense of some of the reasons and the process. For us, I think two things are really helpful. If you're a leader of any kind, you're the youth group leader, you're the counselor, you're a pastor, someone, a deaconess, I've taken a lot of comfort in God's words in 1 Samuel 8:7. They have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. I find comfort in that because my tendency is to say, I gave you good answers. I was patient. I'm trying to be kind. Come on, hang in there. Stick with me. And then some people continue that movement. And this reminds me that it's not about me. I don't have to be mad or get loud or feel a wounded pride. It's not me that's been rejected. It's the Lord. And that turns us to prayer. That turns us to following God, who, though he's been rejected, continues to pursue. Continue to give his good gifts to all men and women alike. Makes the sun to shine, the rain to fall. Unlike us, or unlike me, he doesn't draw a line and give up. His pride is not wounded in such a way that he refuses to follow. And then I think of Jesus, God in the flesh, rejected by men. And we read about this. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not quench. The way of Jesus with the deconverted is not to get on Facebook and scream at them, not to tell them don't let the door hit you on the way out of the church, not to prognosticate on why they lost their faith, not to tell them here's what you should have done and how much more of it. There's a profound tenderness that desires that man, that woman to come back, to remain in relationship. But there's a gentleness as to how that's carried out. There's a wisdom in which Jesus has that he knows. When you paint someone into a corner, when you go toe to toe and nose to nose, no one is in their best mind. You don't get good responses that way. Jesus gives the gift of release, the freedom to move without withdrawing relationship and without refusing to welcome back. And there are some very encouraging statistics on who comes back. That too would be for another time. I've gone over time, but thank you for letting me do that, Zach, and forgive me, brothers and sisters.